You ever like walk out of a conversation and you're like,
Yeah.
did I just say that? What was I thinking?
Oh, yeah, all the time.
Yeah, well, that was me after this political debate I had with a friend recently. It kind of got me thinking, like, are any of us really equipped to like handle all the demands of democracy today?
Yeah.
Just like between the information overload and always having to have an opinion on everything, it feels like it's impossible to make like truly informed political decisions.
It's a lot. It's definitely a complex landscape.
Yeah.
But luckily, we have a book to help us out with this. Too Dumb for Democracy: Why We Make Bad Political Decisions and How We Can Make Better Ones by David Moscrop.
Exactly. Welcome back, everyone, to Rambling Dan Rose Deep Dive Book Reviews. We're glad to have you with us. And today we are going to dive deep into this book.
Yes, we are.
And this one is especially for you because you suggested it.
I'm excited.
So hopefully by the end, we'll all feel a little less dumb about democracy.
I hope so.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
So, David Moscrop is a political theorist.
He is. So that means he's really familiar with all the different theories and structures of democratic systems.
So right from the preface, he shares this story about like this pivotal moment that kind of led him to write the book.
Oh, okay, interesting.
He was reading the work of this neuroscientist, Antonio Damasio,
Okay.
who argues that like emotions play a vital role in decision making.
Interesting.
Even like the decisions we think are like purely rational.
Oh, yeah.
So it's like emotions are always there kind of lurking in the background,
Right.
influencing us in ways that we may not even realize.
Yeah, makes you wonder how much of what we think we're deciding is really us deciding.
Right. So for Moscrop, this was like a total light bulb moment.
Mm.
He realized that like, despite all the theories and ideals about democracy, our political decisions are often really heavily influenced by our emotions.
Makes sense.
And sometimes without us even knowing it.
That's kind of scary when you think about it.
Yeah. And then watching Donald Trump become president, that really solidified his concern, I guess.
Right. I mean, that was a really a turbulent time in politics, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah, he describes it as like a shock, like a sense of disbelief. Like history was unfolding in this way that he never anticipated.
Yeah, I can totally relate to that feeling.
So we have a political theorist grappling with like the emotional realities of politics,
Yeah.
all against the backdrop of this like crazy political moment.
It definitely sets the stage for a thought-provoking book.
Oh, for sure. And in the very first chapter, he kicks things off with a pretty bold question. Are we too dumb for democracy?
I love how blunt that is. Gets right to the point.
Yeah, like the chapter title alone makes you stop and think. But then what's really interesting is that his answer is basically not really. Well, he adds a caveat. He points out that like liberal democracy, which is the system we're most familiar with,
Right.
is relatively new. It's only been around for like 400 years.
Really? It feels like it's been around forever.
I know, right?
Yeah.
But when you think about it in the grand scheme of like political systems, we're practically toddlers.
That's a good point.
So maybe we shouldn't be so hard on ourselves for like struggling with
Right,
it.
we're still learning.
Exactly. So if we're not too dumb, then what's the problem? Like, how does he define bad political decisions?
Well, he says that bad political decisions are often driven by things like bias, misinformation, like hidden motives, gut feelings, and rationalizations, just trying to make ourselves feel better about decisions we've already made. And here's the thing that kind of gets me is that he says that every single one of us is susceptible to these things.
Okay, so no one is immune.
Right.
We're all capable of making those like knee-jerk,
Oh, yeah?
emotionally charged decisions that might not be the best in the long run.
Absolutely. Even when we think we're being totally rational.
Right. So in chapter 2, Why We Make Bad Political Decisions, this is where he gets really personal.
Oh, really? How so?
He uses his younger self as an example. He talks about how he joined a political party without even like really examining his beliefs.
Oh, wow. So he was just kind of going with the flow.
Yeah. And he points out that he was basically substituting enthusiasm for like critical thinking.
I think a lot of people can relate to that, especially when they're younger. You get swept up in the excitement of it all.
For sure. And this is where the book really starts to get interesting because he argues that fixing the outcomes in a democracy actually requires fixing the decision-making process.
So it's not just about getting the right answer.
Right. It's about like how we arrive at those answers.
So it's more about the journey than the destination.
Exactly.
Interesting.
And he argues that a good decision-making process leads to greater trust and legitimacy, even when we disagree with the outcome.
Yeah, if you feel like the process was fair and transparent, you're more likely to accept the results.
Exactly. It's about feeling like your voice was heard, that the process was legitimate. And if we trust the process, we're more likely to accept the results, even if they weren't what we wanted.
I see what you mean.
Yeah, and this chapter also introduces the concept of negativity bias, which is something we'll see pop up again throughout the book.
Oh, I've heard of that. But can you remind me what it is exactly?
Yeah, so negativity bias is like our tendency to pay more attention to
Okay.
and be more influenced by negative information than positive information. And it's like this survival instinct.
It's like that feeling of dread you get when you see a negative news headline.
Exactly. Even though good things are happening too.
Right.
Those negative events just kind of grab our attention.
They stick with us longer.
Yeah. And the book points out that this negativity bias can be exploited, especially in politics. Like, politicians can use our fears,
Right.
our anxieties,
Right.
to push their agendas, even if it's not really in our best interest.
That's kind of a scary thought.
Wow.
So what's the solution? Like, how do we combat that?
Well, he doesn't really get into solutions until later in the book, but he starts to lay the groundwork in Chapter 3,
Oh.
which is called How to Make Better Political Decisions.
So what's the secret? What makes a good political decision?
So he argues that a good political decision is made consciously, with a clear understanding of our reasoning. It's about recognizing our biases, seeking out diverse perspectives,
Oh, yeah. That's important.
and like making sure that our choices align with our values.
So it's not just about blindly following what your chosen party says.
Right. It's about engaging with the issues,
Right.
evaluating information critically,
Okay.
understanding why we believe what we believe.
So it's more about self-reflection.
Yeah, it's about being an active participant in shaping the political landscape,
Right.
rather than just being swept along by like popular opinion or what we see in the media.
I like that. So it's about taking control.
Exactly. So Chapter 4, our bodies, our minds, starts with a pretty intense anecdote. He talks about being mugged in France.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And this isn't just like a random story. He uses it to illustrate the interplay between our rational and emotional brains.
Oh, that makes sense.
Like when we're faced with a threat, our instinctual like fight or flight response takes over.
Yeah.
And it often bypasses our rational thinking.
Right. In those moments, it's not really about thinking logically. It's about survival.
Exactly. And he also argues that we often learn more from those negative experiences,
Oh, interesting.
which again ties back to that negativity bias. It's like we're hardwired to remember the bad stuff more vividly,
It's true. I think I can relate to that.
which can obviously like skew our perception of the world. And so he uses this mugging story to talk about the challenges of like navigating politics today in this media landscape that's dominated by negativity.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
He specifically calls out social media,
Mm.
saying that it's designed to like trigger those primal responses,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
often at the expense of thoughtful analysis.
It's all about getting those clicks and likes.
Right. So Chapter 5, Mental Shortcuts and the Media.
Okay.
That one delves into how our brains are wired
Uh-huh.
and how that affects our political choices.
Yeah.
And it starts with the cognitive revolution,
Mm-hmm.
which is this idea that like even though humans have achieved these amazing cognitive abilities,
Right.
we still rely on like those ancient instinctual mechanisms for making decisions.
Oh, so we're not as evolved as we think we are.
Right. So he connects this to the work of Daniel Kahneman, who talks about System 1 and System 2 thinking. So System 1 is that fast, intuitive,
Mm-hmm.
emotion-driven system.
Okay.
And then System 2 is the slower, more deliberate, rational system.
So it's like two different operating systems in our brain.
Yeah. And the problem is that System 1 often dominates our political decisions.
Which explains a lot.
Right. It leads us to rely on those mental shortcuts rather than engaging in like deeper analysis.
Okay, yeah.
So he talks about framing, which is how information is presented to us and how it can manipulate our perceptions. And he gives this example of a disease outbreak scenario where the way the information was framed led people to make completely different choices, even though the facts were the same.
Wow, so just the way you present information can have a huge impact.
Yeah, it's crazy. And it really shows how we're susceptible to like subtle cues,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
like word choices.
Yeah, like when politicians use euphemisms to make something sound less bad.
Exactly. He also talks about the death tax,
Yeah.
which is basically just like a reframing of the estate tax.
Oh, right, but death tax sounds so much more negative.
Right. Like estate tax sounds pretty neutral,
Yeah.
but death tax, it's like an immediate emotional trigger. It makes it sound like you're being punished for dying.
That's a really good example of how language can be used to manipulate us.
Yeah. And it can really bypass those rational thought processes.
So it's like a form of propaganda almost.
Yeah. So now in Chapter 6, our institutions. he kind of shifts the focus
Okay.
from our individual brains
Okay.
to the structures that shape our political lives.
Oh, interesting.
He uses this analogy of a path in the jungle. So just like a well-worn path can guide you through a dense forest, institutions guide our behavior often without us even realizing it.
That's a good analogy.
And he argues that institutions like political parties, elections, and the media, they're essential for democracy,
Okay.
but they're also vulnerable to manipulation.
So they're kind of a double-edged sword.
Yeah. He also brings up Watergate as an example of how institutions can be used to undermine democracy, even in countries with strong democratic traditions. He also examines the Trans Mountain Pipeline controversy
Okay, I remember that.
in Canada,
Uh-huh.
and he uses that to illustrate the complexities of decision-making within, like, these democratic institutions.
Yeah, where you have all these competing interests and different levels of government and public opinion.
Yeah. And it just highlights how messy those decision-making processes can be, even with the best of intentions.
Right. So how do we make sense of it all? How do we navigate these complexities?
Well, that's what he tries to unpack in the next chapter. It's called 5 Ways of Thinking About Thinking.
Yeah.
So it's like this whirlwind tour of different psychological models
Okay.
that can help us understand how we make political decisions.
So what are some of those models?
Well, he uses this metaphor of a dinner party with each guest representing a different model of political thinking.
Oh, I like that.
And 2 of the most compelling ones, I think, are motivated reasoning and system justification.
Interesting. Tell me more about those.
Okay, so motivated reasoning is like our tendency to interpret information in a way that confirms our pre-existing beliefs,
Oh, yeah.
even if those beliefs are wrong. So it's about protecting our worldview
Right.
rather than seeking out, like, objective truth,
So it's like we're always trying to be right, even when we're wrong.
pretty much.
Mm,
And it can be quite unconscious, which makes it even trickier to overcome.
I see. What about system justification? What's that one about?
So system justification is our tendency to defend existing social systems and structures,
Yeah.
even when they're, like, unfair or unjust.
Oh, so it's like we're wired to maintain the status quo.
Yeah, even if it's not serving us well. It's like we cling to familiarity even if it might be hurting us in the long run.
That's fascinating. So are we just doomed to repeat the same mistakes? Like, is there any way to break free from these patterns?
Well, that's where Moscrop's call to action comes in.
Okay.
The next chapter is titled, I Want You to Make Better Political Decisions.
Mhm.
And it's like this rally cry for all of us to, like, step up
Okay.
and become better political decision makers.
I like it. So he's not just pointing out the problems, he's offering solutions.
Yeah, he's saying, okay, we've diagnosed the problem.
Yeah.
Now let's roll up our sleeves and do something about it.
Love that. So how do we become better political decision makers? What does he suggest we do?
Well, that's where the second half of the book gets really practical. Like, he shifts from diagnosing the problem to actually offering solutions.
Okay. I like it. Practical advice.
Yeah. He outlines strategies for navigating this complex terrain and becoming, like, more thoughtful and engaged citizens.
Give me the cheat sheet.
All right, so chapter 8, I want you to make better political decisions. It feels like a pep talk
Oh, okay.
for anyone who's just feeling overwhelmed by, like, the state of politics today.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that feeling.
It's like this call to action,
Okay.
urging us to, like, reclaim our agency and become more informed and deliberate and responsible in our political choices.
So it's about taking back control.
Yeah. And he really emphasizes the importance of motivation.
Oh.
Like, it's not enough to just be bombarded with information.
Right.
We actually have to care about the issues. Like, we
Yeah.
have to feel invested in the outcomes.
Yeah, if you don't care, why bother? Right.
Exactly. And this is where that elaboration likelihood model comes in.
Oh, right. The one we talked about earlier.
Yeah. Remember that central route to persuasion?
Mm-hmm.
The one that actually leads to lasting change,
Uh-huh.
that requires active engagement and a willingness to consider different viewpoints?
So it's not just about passively consuming information.
Right. It's about actually wrestling with the ideas.
Okay, I can see how that would be more effective.
And he gives this example of, like, the overwhelming volume of political advertising during the 2016 U.S. presidential election.
Oh, yeah. That was crazy.
It was insane.
Just constant ads everywhere.
And he points out that, like, a lot of that advertising focused on, like, character attacks and emotional appeals
Yeah.
rather than, like, actual substantive policy discussions.
Right. It was all about triggering our emotions.
Exactly. And it was designed to trigger that system one thinking,
Okay.
manipulate our biases, our fears, rather than actually engage our rational minds.
So it's like we were being bombarded with noise rather than substance.
Yeah. And it makes you wonder if all that noise actually, like, hindered our ability to make good judgments.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
So how do we cut through all the clutter? Like, what are some practical tips he gives?
Well, he talks a lot about awareness. Like,
Mhm.
we need to recognize how framing can shape our perceptions. How the way information is presented can, like, nudge us towards a certain conclusion.
So it's about being critical of the information we're consuming.
Yeah, not just passively absorbing everything.
Okay, what else?
He encourages us to slow down, engage in that system two thinking,
Oh, yeah.
be more deliberate.
Yeah, and actively seek out diverse viewpoints. Like, it's about being thoughtful rather than reactive.
That can be tough in today's world, though, right? Like, everything is so fast-paced.
Oh, for sure. It's like you're constantly being pulled in a million different directions.
Yeah, you see a headline, you have an instant reaction, and then you're on to the next thing.
Exactly. But he's saying, like, we need to resist that urge to react impulsively
Right.
and create space for more deliberate engagement.
Okay. So slow down, think things through, don't just react.
But he also acknowledges that individual effort alone isn't enough.
Right.
We also need to advocate for systemic change,
Okay.
to push for institutions that actually support good decision-making. So it's about working on ourselves and working to improve the systems we operate within.
Exactly. It's a two-pronged approach.
Interesting.
So in Chapter 9, you cannot fix it all on your own. Why our milieu and institutions must change.
Mm-hmm.
He really dives into those institutional changes. And one of the interesting ideas he brings up is participatory budgeting.
Oh, what's that? I've never heard of that.
So participatory budgeting is basically this process that allows citizens to directly influence how public funds are allocated.
Oh, wow. So, like, they get a say in how their tax dollars are spent.
Yeah. It gives people a real voice in shaping their communities.
That's a really cool idea, but can that actually work on a large scale? I mean, it sounds great for local communities, but what about, like, national or even global levels?
Well, it's definitely a challenge, but he argues it's worth experimenting with. And he points to Porto Alegre, Brazil, where participatory budgeting was actually pioneered in the 1980s.
Really?
Yeah, so there, citizens gather in these neighborhood assemblies to discuss needs and priorities. And then they vote on how to allocate a portion of the city budget.
So it's like direct democracy in action.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So it actually can work.
Well, at least in some contexts.
Yeah.
It suggests that even on a larger scale, involving people in these decisions can lead to more responsive and equitable outcomes.
Yeah, it makes sense. If people feel like they have a voice, they're more likely to be invested in the outcome.
Exactly. And it builds trust in government.
Right.
And it empowers citizens to take ownership of their communities.
So it's not just about complaining about the government. It's about actually getting involved and shaping the decisions that affect your life.
Exactly. And then he also talks about citizens' assemblies.
Oh, what are those?
So citizens' assemblies are these groups of randomly selected citizens
Okay.
who are brought together to deliberate on specific policy issues.
So it's kind of like jury duty for democracy?
Yeah, exactly. And the idea is that by bringing together this diverse group of people who are representative of the broader population, you can get a more informed and nuanced perspective.
I like that. So it's not just the usual suspects weighing in.
Right. And he mentions that Canada has actually experimented with citizens' assemblies in the past.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he talks about assemblies in British Columbia and Ontario that considered electoral reform.
Interesting. And did they actually implement any of their recommendations?
Well, not ultimately. But he argues that the process itself was really valuable, and it shows that there's a growing recognition of the need for more citizen involvement in the political process.
Makes sense. But those kinds of initiatives must take a lot of resources and support, right?
Yeah, he emphasizes that. Like, it takes time, it takes money, and it takes expertise to create those spaces for meaningful citizen engagement.
Right. It's not something you can just throw together overnight.
No. And then he also talks about deep diversity.
Oh, what does he mean by that?
So it's not just about having, like, representation from different backgrounds.
Okay.
It's also about diversity in how we think.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's not enough to just have people from different backgrounds in the room. We need to have people who think differently,
Yeah.
who approach problems from different angles.
He argues that good political decision-making actually requires a diversity of, like, cognitive approaches and perspectives.
So we need people who challenge our assumptions, help us see things from different angles.
Exactly. And this is where I love that saying, if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room.
Right. We need to surround ourselves with people who make us think.
Yeah. And be willing to be challenged,
Okay.
to be uncomfortable, to potentially even be proven wrong.
Because none of us has all the answers.
Right. It's about recognizing that the best solutions often come from bringing together like diverse perspectives and working collaboratively.
It's about harnessing the collective wisdom of the group.
Exactly. Now, he also talks about the importance of slowing down.
Okay.
Like in today's world, it's so easy to get caught up in the like frenetic pace of the news cycle.
Oh, yeah, it's nonstop.
And to feel this pressure to like react to every headline, to have an immediate opinion on everything.
Yeah, I definitely feel that. It's exhausting.
And it's not conducive to thoughtful decision-making. So we need to resist that urge to react impulsively.
Right.
And create those spaces for more deliberate engagement.
Okay.
He suggests taking time to reflect, to really process information, and engage in those deeper conversations that allow for nuance and complexity.
So maybe we need to put down our phones more often, step away from the screens, and actually have those face-to-face conversations where we can really listen to each other. Yeah, exactly. Even when we disagree. Right. It's about understanding where the other person is coming from.
And then he also emphasizes iteration, which is like good political decision-making isn't about getting it right the first time. It's this ongoing process of like learning and reflecting and adapting our approach.
So it's about being open to feedback.
Yeah.
Willing to experiment.
Uh-huh.
And committed to continuous improvement.
Exactly. Like embrace the messiness of democracy.
I love that. It's not about being perfect. It's about being willing to learn and grow.
Yeah. And so now we're at the final chapter, conclusion. Towards better political decisions, and then what?
Okay, this is where he wraps everything up. So what's the final verdict? Are we doomed, or is there hope?
Well, he definitely doesn't shy away from the serious threats facing democracy.
Yeah, like what are some of those?
He talks about the rise of authoritarianism,
Right.
the spread of misinformation, the erosion of trust in institutions. Like it can feel pretty bleak at times.
Yeah, it's a lot to process.
But even amidst all those challenges, he ends on this note of cautious optimism.
Okay, so there's a glimmer of hope.
Yeah. He reminds us that humans have faced these seemingly insurmountable obstacles throughout history.
Right.
And we've found ways to overcome them.
We're a pretty resilient species.
Yeah. And he argues that we have the capacity for reason, for compassion, for collective action. Like, those are the very qualities that have allowed us to progress as a species and build more just and equitable societies.
So it's not all doom and gloom. We have the power to change things.
Right. It's a powerful reminder that we're not powerless.
Okay.
Like, we have agency. We can shape our destiny both individually and collectively.
But that hope isn't passive, right?
Right. It's a call to action.
Okay.
It's a reminder that the future of democracy is not predetermined.
Right.
We create it.
Okay.
Through our choices, our actions, our willingness to engage in this messy, challenging,
Yeah.
but ultimately rewarding work of self-governance.
It's a lot of work, but it's worth it.
Yeah. So he urges us to be more informed, more engaged, more responsible citizens,
Okay.
to demand better from our institutions, and to never give up on the pursuit of a more just and equitable world.
Powerful stuff.
Yeah. So we've explored Too Dumb for Democracy in detail.
We have.
From the initial diagnosis to the proposed solutions. What are your overall thoughts now that we've reached the end?
Honestly, I think this is a must-read for anyone who's concerned about the state of democracy today. It's like a wake-up call, a toolkit, and a source of inspiration all rolled into one.
Yeah, I agree. It's intellectually stimulating, but it also speaks to something deeper, like our responsibility to ourselves and to each other as citizens.
It's a reminder that democracy is fragile. It's something we need to actively nurture and protect.
And I think what really resonated with me was his emphasis on individual responsibility and systemic change. Like, it's not an either-or proposition, it's both.
Right. We need to work on ourselves while simultaneously pushing for better systems.
Exactly. But of course, no deep dive is complete without some critical analysis.
You're right. We got to be fair and balanced here.
Yeah.
So what are some of the criticisms of the book?
Well, one common criticism is that while he's really good at diagnosing the problems, he's a bit light on concrete solutions.
Okay.
Like he mentions participatory budgeting and
Right.
citizens' assemblies.
Uh-huh.
But he doesn't necessarily provide detailed blueprints for how to implement those things on a large scale.
That's a fair point. It's easier said than done.
Right. And he also primarily focuses on the challenges of like Western liberal democracies.
Okay.
So his arguments might need further exploration to see how they apply to other political systems and cultural contexts.
Right, because democracy looks different around the world.
Exactly. But I think it's important to remember that this book is like a starting point.
Okay.
It's a catalyst for further conversation and exploration. It's meant to provoke our thinking and inspire us to seek out those solutions.
So it's about asking the right questions, even if we don't have all the answers yet.
Exactly. Another criticism is that it can be a bit overwhelming for readers who are new to these concepts.
Yeah, it's definitely a dense read at times.
He covers a lot of ground, like
Yeah.
political science, psychology, neuroscience, history.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
But I think his writing style is generally accessible.
Okay.
And he uses relatable examples.
Yeah, I like that he uses personal anecdotes. It makes it more engaging.
Yeah, and it makes those complex ideas feel more grounded in our everyday experiences.
So despite those criticisms, you'd still recommend the book?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's a valuable and timely contribution to the conversation about democracy. It's a book that stays with you,
Yeah.
prompts you to question, to engage, and to never take your rights and responsibilities for granted.
I agree. His analysis is really insightful and empowering. Even when we're facing these complex challenges, we have the agency to make a difference.
And to our listener, if you're intrigued by these ideas, we highly recommend checking out Too Dumb for Democracy.
Yeah, it's a great read.
It's a book that will challenge your thinking, broaden your perspective, and leave you feeling more informed and hopefully more hopeful about the future of democracy.
It's a reminder that we're all in this together and that our choices matter.
So now, before we wrap up, I want to leave our listener with a final thought to ponder. Something inspired by the book, but not explicitly stated in our discussion.
Ooh, I like that. Leave them with something to chew on. Okay, hit me.
Okay, how about this? If, as Moscrop argues, our brains are wired for survival in small groups, how can we adapt our thinking to the demands of a globalized world where our decisions have far-reaching consequences?
That's a great question. It really gets to the heart of that tension between our evolutionary heritage and the challenges of modern political life. Like, we have to bridge that gap.
Right.
To think beyond our immediate tribe and consider the needs of a global community.
It's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. Like, if we can harness our capacity for reason, compassion, and cooperation,
Yeah.
we might actually be able to create a world that's more just equitable and sustainable for everyone.
It's a goal worth striving for. And who knows, maybe we'll even prove that we're not too dumb for democracy after all.
I love that. This deep dive has been fantastic, and I feel like I've learned so much, not just about the book, but also about myself and the world we live in.
Me too. It's
Right.
been a pleasure diving into these ideas with you, and I hope our listener has found it equally engaging and thought-provoking.
Too Dumb for Democracy is a book that will stay with you long after you finish reading it. It's a call to action, a reminder that democracy is not a spectator sport.
It's a process that requires our active participation, our critical thinking, and our unwavering commitment to creating a better world for ourselves and for generations to come.
So if you're ready to challenge your assumptions, to engage in meaningful conversations, and to take ownership of your role in shaping the future of democracy, then Too Dumb for Democracy is the perfect book for you.
We encourage you to dive in and discover the power of informed, engaged citizenship.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.